A mother looks into her baby's cradle and knows with absolute bone-deep certainty that the child staring back at her is not her child. The face is wrong. The cry is wrong. Something behind those eyes is ancient and hollow and hungry. She doesn't call for the doctor. She calls for the priest. And what happens next will make you sick to your stomach. Medieval Europe wasn't just dark in the metaphorical sense. It was dark in every way a world can be. Tallow candles barely cut the blackness in cramped cottages where entire families slept together for warmth. Infant mortality was catastrophic. In some regions, nearly half of all children died before their 5th birthday. Disease moved invisibly, striking without warning or logic. A healthy, laughing baby could become silent and rigid within a week, its limbs wasted, its development frozen, its screaming endless and inhuman sounding. Parents had no germ theory, they had no neurology, they had no diagnosis for autism, cerebral palsy, metabolic disorders, or genetic conditions. What they had was folklore. And folklore gave them an answer that was, in its own twisted way, a mercy. The fairies took your real child and left this thing in its place. The changeling myth spread across Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Germany, Scandinavia, and beyond. Every culture with forests and fear had its own version, but the mechanics were remarkably consistent. Fairies, it was said, coveted healthy human babies. They'd slip into a home at night, steal the perfect, unblemished child, and substitute one of their own, a fairy creature, ancient and malevolent, wrapped in infant skin. The signs were unmistakable, according to those who believed. The child suddenly stopped meeting eyes. It stopped hitting milestones. It cried constantly or eerily not at all. It ate ravenously but never grew. It had unusual physical features. We recognize every single one of those descriptions today as symptoms of developmental conditions and childhood illness. But in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, that list of symptoms was a death warrant. Here's what they didn't know, or what they refused to admit to themselves. The changeling belief didn't just explain disability, it solved it. Because if the creature in the cradle wasn't your child, you had no obligation to it. Medieval families operated on brutal economic logic. An extra mouth that couldn't eventually work the fields, tend the animals, or bring in a wage wasn't a child. It was a liability that could sink an entire household. The average peasant family lived on the absolute edge of subsistence. A bad harvest meant starvation. A sick cow meant ruin. A child with severe disabilities requiring constant care in a world with zero social safety nets, zero medical support, zero charitable infrastructure, that child could mean the death of everyone else. The changeling myth gave parents, especially mothers who would have been blamed for producing an imperfect child, a story. Not a cruel story in their minds, an explanation, a framework, a way to grieve the healthy child they expected while justifying what came next. And what came next was horrific. The prescribed methods for reversing a changeling substitution read like torture manuals. In Ireland, the suspected changeling might be held over an open fire to force the fairy to reveal itself and flee. In Germany, documented cases from the 1600s describe infants placed on cold hillsides overnight, exposed to the elements in hopes the fairies would reclaim their own. In 1895, in County Tipperary, Ireland, a woman named Bridget Cleary was burned to death by her own husband, who was convinced she had been replaced by a fairy. She was 26 years old. He told the court he was waiting for the real Bridget to come riding back on a white horse. The court called it murder. The village had called it sense. Here's the twist that makes your stomach drop. The Catholic Church didn't just tolerate the changeling belief. In many documented instances, it actively participated in it. Church records from Germany and the British Isles show priests performing rites of exposure, essentially blessed abandonment for children deemed changelings. Why would an institution built on the sanctity of human life sanction leaving infants to die? Because disability was theologically inconvenient. Medieval theology held that baptism was spiritually transformative. It should produce visibly improved children, compliant and responsive to God's grace. A child who remained unreachable, who screamed through Mass, who didn't respond to their name, that child was evidence that something had gone wrong. Better to explain it as supernatural substitution than to question the efficacy of the sacrament. The Church also controlled the land, the courts, and the record-keeping. Families with disabled children who died under suspicious conditions rarely faced consequences. The paperwork simply reflected what everyone already believed. This isn't just history, it's a pattern we keep repeating. Every era finds a new way to classify certain human beings as less than, as inconvenient, as burdensome, as not quite real. The 20th century didn't use fairy tales. It used eugenics programs, institutional warehousing, forced sterilization laws that were on the books in the United States until the 1970s. The economic logic was identical. These people are a drain. The language was different. The result was the same. And today, in countries without robust disability support systems, families still face impossible choices. The institutions have changed their vocabulary. The underlying calculus hasn't moved an inch. The real demon in the Changeling story wasn't a fairy. It was a world that told parents their worth was measured by their child's productivity, and then left them completely alone when that child was suffering. The church didn't save those children. The village didn't save them. The state didn't exist to save them. The myth gave everyone permission to look away. History calls it superstition, but superstition is what we name the brutal coping mechanisms of people abandoned by every system that should have helped them. So, here's the question that should keep you up tonight. When we build systems, medical, economic, political, that make caring for vulnerable people financially ruinous for ordinary families, are we really so different from those medieval villages? Or are we just telling a more sophisticated story to justify the same abandonment? If this history made you uncomfortable in ways you're still sitting with, you're in the right place. Subscribe, because next week we're going even deeper, and the truth only gets darker from here.